Alright guys, it's time to flex your React programming muscles and put into practice everything that you learned in the previous lesson. The idea here is to use conditional rendering to show different components depending on a particular variable. And that variable is one called user_is_registered, which lives inside the app.js. So the idea here is that when the user tries to authenticate themselves with your website, and they enter their username and password, it might be that the database recognizes that username and password, in which case this becomes true. But it might also be that they don't actually exist on our database and they've never registered before. So users registered becomes false. And depending on the value of this condition, we want to do a couple of things. If the user is indeed registered, then we want to show them a login screen. But if they're not registered on our database, then we want to show them a register screen. Now, if we're showing them the register screen, then we actually want to show them this confirm password field, because when they register, they should probably type their password twice in order to validate it. But if it's just the login screen, then we don't actually want to show this. So this is the final functionality you're aiming for. When the user is registered is set to false, you see a register screen with username, password, confirm password, and the button says register. When the user is registered is set to true, then you see a login screen with just username, password, and the button says login. Go ahead and fork the starting project for this challenge and try to go through the steps and complete it. Pause the video now and come back if you need to see me walk through the solution with you. Alright, so the first thing we're trying to do is to show the word login as the button text if user registered is true. At the moment, if we look inside our form.jsx, we've got this text here saying register, and we want to switch up that text depending on the value of our user is registered variable. But unfortunately, this lives inside app.js, and I mentioned that you can't move that variable. So how do you get it over to the form? Well, you can of course pass it over as a prop. So let's create a prop called isRegistered, and we'll set it to equal the value of this variable, user is registered. So frequently, when you're rendering things conditionally, you're going to be doing it via props that have been passed over. So now inside our form component, we can receive those props and check for it in order to render something different inside our button. In this case, what we want to do is we want to check to see if props.isRegistered, let's make sure that I spell it right, is true. And if so, we're going to show the word login. But otherwise, we're going to show the word register. And this is not being highlighted properly because we haven't yet wrapped it inside a set of curly braces. Now, when we go back to our app.js and we switch this variable from false to true, you'll see that that goes to login. And then when it's false, and when we go back, it goes back to register. So that's step 1 completed. Now, step 2 is to only show the confirm password input, so this one, if the user registered variable is false. Remember that when we have a register screen, we want to have the confirm password input, but when we have a login screen, we don't want to have that field showing at all. How can we do this? Well, we know that we receive this is registered value as a prop inside our form, so we can determine whether if this input actually gets rendered or not. And the most efficient way of doing this is through using the AND operator. Let's open up a set of parentheses and check if props.isRegistered is equal to false. And if so, so 2 ampersands, then we're going to render this input component. But if it's not false, i.e. if this is true, then we're not going to render anything at all. Now let's go ahead and test this out. So when this is false, we see the register screen with that extra confirm password field. But if this is true, then we see the login screen without that extra input. There's quite a few ways that you could have done this. You could have, for example, used a ternary operator instead. So you can add a question mark here to check this condition, render this if it's true, and then render null if it's not true. And this gives you the same effect. But of course, if you're after the shortest possible way of creating this kind of conditional rendering, then it's going to be through the use of the ampersand operator. And that means we get to delete the null and all of the extra syntax. And in fact, you can even change this props.isRegistered equals to false to a more simple form, just adding an exclamation mark in front. So this basically turns this value to the opposite of what it used to be, and it's effectively the same as checking if isRegistered is false. And then we end up with a one-line statement that does everything we want. Did you manage to get this challenge right? If not, be sure to head back to your own code and try to complete it now that you've watched the video. We're going to be using this concept of conditional rendering a lot in the coming lessons, and it's a really fundamental part of React. So be sure that you're really comfortable with it before you move on. All right, in the next lesson, we're going to be talking about a big topic, which is state, and how we can track and change state in our apps. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.